My husband told me to stop overreacting when I asked about his late calls, claiming I simply did not understand business passion. But he forgot two things. First, his phone was still mirrored to his parents' 85-inch television. Second, the corporation his mistress claimed to represent is actually mine. A single text message calling him baby lit up the screen, exposing his cheap affair and giving me the perfect excuse to destroy his family's delusions in one night. My name is Alara Vance, to the world, and specifically to the pompous family I married into. I am a dusty archivist who spends her days organizing files for a mid-tier accounting firm. I am the boring, dependable paycheck that keeps the lights on while my husband chases his delusions of grandeur. What none of them know is that the archiving I do is for my own portfolio. I am the silent founder of Nexus Capital, one of the most aggressive venture capital funds in the United States. I move hundreds of millions of dollars before breakfast, but at the dinner table, I am treated like a servant who got lucky. The Prescotts live in a sprawling mansion in the Hamptons that they do not own. It is a rental, paid for by shuffling debt between credit cards and taking out predatory loans they have no intention of repaying. They walk around with the unearned confidence of old money, turning their noses up at the working class while drowning in a sea of red ink. Kyle, my husband, is the crown prince of this crumbling kingdom. He has the jawline of a movie star and the business acumen of a toddler. He truly believes he is one deal away from being the next tech billionaire, viewing my steady income as a lack of ambition rather than the lifeline it actually is. Then there is Madeline, his mother. She treats my wardrobe like a personal insult. She constantly reminds me that Kyle could have married a debutante or a heiress, someone who knows how to dress for the season and does not buy her blouses off the rack. I endure her passive-aggressive comments about my shoes and my hair not because I am weak, but because I am patient. Through a complex web of shell companies, I have spent the last 6 months quietly purchasing every single one of the Prescotts' distressed debts. I do not just live in their house, I own the paper trail that keeps them out of prison. The beginning of the end started when Kyle announced he had found a savior. He came home beaming about a revolutionary partnership with a young, dynamic entrepreneur named Sasha. He claimed she was going to turn the family business around with her brilliant connections. I did a background check on Sasha in 5 minutes while pretending to chop vegetables. Her portfolio was a graveyard of shell companies and lawsuits. When I gently suggested to Kyle that her credentials looked inflated, he laughed in my face. He told me I was being petty and that I simply did not understand the nuances of high-level commerce because I was too busy filing papers. 2 days later, Sasha came for tea. She walked into the living room wearing a dress that cost more than my car but fit her poorly, clearly designed to distract rather than impress. She spoke in a slurry of corporate buzzwords, tossing around terms like synergy and paradigm shift without knowing what they meant. Madeline ate it up. She fawned over Sasha, calling her the epitome of a modern woman and shooting me pitying glances, as if to say this was what a real partner looked like. I sat quietly in the corner, sipping my tea and watching. I saw the way Sasha looked at the room, calculating the value of the furniture, but more importantly, I saw the way she looked at my husband. It was not the look of a business partner. When she laughed at one of Kyle's unfunny jokes, she let her hand linger on his shoulder a second too long, her fingers tracing the fabric of his jacket. Kyle leaned into the touch, his eyes glazing over with lust masquerading as professional admiration. That was when I knew. This was not just a financial scam. It was a cliché. And I decided right then that I would not just expose the fraud. I would let them play their little game until the stakes were high enough to crush them all. The late-night phone calls became a ritual. Every evening around 11, Kyle's phone would light up, and he would immediately retreat to the balcony, closing the glass door tight behind him. When I asked, he claimed he was managing international time zones, speaking with investors in Tokyo and London. It was a lazy lie. I knew for a fact that the markets he claimed to be monitoring were currently closed or inactive, but I said nothing. Instead, I logged into the joint bank account he thought I was too simple to monitor. The transaction history told a different story. There were charges at high-end steakhouses and boutique hotels in the city, bills totaling hundreds of dollars for two people, marked on days he claimed to be working late at the office. He was not pitching business strategies, he was courting a disaster. The tension culminated during a Friday night dinner. Kyle insisted we invite Sasha, treating her arrival like a royal visitation. She sat at our dining table, sipping wine that cost more than Kyle's car payments, and began to spin a fantasy about her deep connections in the financial world. She looked my father-in-law in the eye and claimed she was personal friends with the founder of Nexus Capital. She described the CEO as a brash, loud man from Texas who loved golf. I took a slow sip of my water, fighting the urge to laugh. I am the founder of Nexus Capital. I am a woman from Connecticut, and I detest golf. I decided to test the depth of her delusion. I cleared my throat and asked her a specific question about the current debt-to-equity strategy Nexus was employing for their tech acquisitions. It was a standard question for anyone actually in the industry. Sasha blinked, clearly caught off guard, before recovering with a condescending smirk. She waved her hand dismissively and said that high-level finance was about intuition and synergy, not boring numbers, and that Nexus was pivoting away from traditional metrics anyway. It was a nonsensical answer. Before I could point that out, Kyle slammed his fork down. He turned to me, his face flushed with embarrassment, and hissed that I should stop trying to sound smart. He told me to stop embarrassing him with my low-level administrative questions and to let the real professionals talk. He looked at me with genuine disdain, as if my desire for clarity was a personal defect. Sasha leaned forward, offering a smile that dripped with fake sympathy. She told Kyle not to be so harsh, explaining that people with limited career horizons often become suspicious because they cannot grasp the big picture. Madeline, never one to miss a chance to twist the knife, nodded in agreement. She gestured to Sasha's flashy outfit and told me I should take notes on how a supportive partner presents herself. She suggested that if I had half of Sasha's charisma, perhaps Kyle would not be so stressed. I looked down at my plate, absorbing the insults, letting them pile up like evidence in a dossier. Then I saw it. Sasha's hands were in her lap, hidden by the tablecloth, but her shoulders shifted slightly. A second later, Kyle's phone, sitting face down next to his wine glass, buzzed against the wood. He glanced down, a reflex he could not control, and his eyes darted to Sasha. I asked him who was calling at this hour. The air in the room vanished. Kyle grabbed his linen napkin and threw it onto his plate. He glared at me and delivered the line that would seal his fate. He told me to stop overreacting. He shouted that I was paranoid and ungrateful, and that Sasha was the savior of this family. He demanded I show some respect or leave the table. I did not scream. I did not cry. The emotional part of me, the wife who once loved him, died in that chair. I stood up calmly, apologized for my lack of vision, and excused myself to the kitchen. Once out of sight, I pulled out my phone. I did not check his messages. I did not need to. Instead, I sent a text to my executive assistant. The message was simple. I told him to prepare the acquisition files and the foreclosure notices. The observation phase was over. It was time for the demolition. Kyle announced that he was transforming our living room into a global launch pad. He planned a grand presentation to officially sign the investment deal with Sasha, and he had invited a dozen local bankers and old family friends to witness his ascension. He wanted witnesses for his triumph, but he had no idea he was actually assembling a jury for his execution. Sasha arrived at the house 3 hours early, ostensibly to set up the equipment and review the slide deck. I was supposed to be at my office in the city, filing papers and fetching coffee, but I was actually parked 2 streets away, watching the live feed from my phone. I had installed pinhole cameras in the study and the living room 3 days prior. I watched in high definition as Sasha and Kyle entered the study. They did not open a laptop or look at a single spreadsheet. Instead, they spent 45 minutes intertwined on the leather sofa my father-in-law prized so highly. I had enough footage to grant me a divorce in any court in the state, but a private email with video attachments felt too merciful. I needed a spectacle. When I finally walked through the front door, pretending to have just returned from a long shift, the house was buzzing with frantic energy. My parents-in-law immediately intercepted me in the hallway. Madeline informed me that for tonight's event, it would be best if I did not sit at the main table. She claimed there were not enough chairs for the VIPs and that I would be more useful managing the refreshments. They were demoting me to a waitress in my own home. I accepted the role with a docile nod, knowing that the staff always sees more than the guests. The humiliation continued in the living room. Sasha presented Madeline with a bright orange designer handbag, claiming it was a gift from her recent trip to Paris. Madeline squealed with delight, clutching the bag like a holy relic and making a pointed comment about how wonderful it was to be surrounded by generous people who had actual taste. I glanced at the stitching on the handle. It was a high-grade counterfeit, likely purchased for $200 in a back alley. But I said nothing. I let Madeline preen over her piece of plastic while she looked at my worn leather satchel with undisguised disgust. Kyle found me a moment later and shoved a handwritten list of chores into my chest. He needed the ice crushed, the hors d'oeuvres plated, and, most importantly, his lucky blue dress shirt ironed immediately. He needed to look sharp for the cameras and told me I should try to make myself useful since I had contributed nothing else to this deal. I took the shirt from him without a word. I went to the laundry room and pressed the fabric until it was crisp and flawless. I took my time, ensuring every crease was sharp. I wanted him to look his absolute best when his world fell apart. It was the final act of service I would ever perform for him. By 7 in the evening, the guests began to arrive. They were a collection of faded socialites and hungry bankers, people who smelled money and wanted a piece of the action. They filled the room with the murmur of polite conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses, eagerly awaiting the financial miracle Kyle had promised. I moved through the crowd with a silver tray, invisible to them, offering champagne and sparkling water. I retreated to the kitchen to refill the ice bucket, and Sasha followed me in. She leaned against the marble island, swirling her wine, her eyes gleaming with malice. She lowered her voice and told me that I should be realistic about my future. She said that after this deal closed, Kyle would be moving into a different tax bracket and would need a wife who could keep up with him. She called me a stepping stone that had served its purpose and suggested I start looking for a small apartment. I stopped crushing the ice and looked her dead in the eye. I did not raise my voice. I gave her a cold, thin smile and told her that she was absolutely right. I told her that Kyle was about to get exactly what he deserved. She laughed, thinking I was admitting defeat, and walked back out to the party, unaware that she was walking straight into a firing squad. The presentation began with the kind of unearned confidence that usually precedes a historic disaster. Kyle had rearranged the furniture to transform the living room into a stage, mimicking the aesthetic of a technology conference he had watched online but never attended. He stood front and center, wearing a microphone clipped to his lapel that was not actually connected to any speakers, purely for the visual effect of authority. Behind him, the massive 85-inch television, which his parents were still paying off in monthly installments, glowed with the title slide of his pitch deck. He had connected both his laptop and his personal smartphone to the screen, ensuring a seamless integration of his digital life for the audience. Sasha stood by his side, acting as the high-powered co-pilot. She did not speak in sentences. She spoke in a word salad of corporate jargon. Every time she opened her mouth, she dropped terms like disruptive synergy and paradigm shift. She used them like magic spells, hoping that if she said dynamic vertical integration enough times, nobody would notice that their business model was effectively a pyramid scheme built on sand. She pointed at the graphs with a laser pointer, circling numbers that had been fabricated out of thin air. My father-in-law, Richard, sat in the front row, mesmerized. He nodded his head in a rhythmic trance. I knew for a fact that Richard could not read a balance sheet to save his life, and he likely thought blockchain was a type of jewelry. But he saw a jagged green line pointing toward the top right corner of the screen, and that was enough to satisfy him. He was already mentally spending the money, perhaps imagining a new yacht or a restoration of his club membership. Then came the centerpiece of their deception. Kyle paused for dramatic effect, looked around the room, and announced that Nexus Capital had officially agreed to partner with the Prescott Group. He claimed that, thanks to Sasha's intimate and long-standing relationship with the board, Nexus was injecting $50 million into the project. The room gasped. $50 million was a number that commanded respect, even from the skeptics in the back. I stood in the shadows near the kitchen door, clutching a silver tray of half-empty champagne flutes. My face remained a mask of dull servitude, but my thumb was active. I slid my phone from my apron pocket, keeping it concealed behind the tray. I opened the secure admin app for Nexus Capital. I did not need to call the board. I was the board. With a few silent taps, I authorized a system-wide alert to be flagged on any external communications referencing the Prescott accounts. I was essentially arming a bomb that they were currently juggling. Kyle, emboldened by the gasp of the audience, launched into a monologue about values. It was grotesque. He paced back and forth, lecturing the room on the importance of total honesty and transparency in business. He sneered as he spoke about the average worker, the people who clocked in at 9 and left at 5, claiming they were too afraid to seize destiny. He looked directly at me for a split second when he said that some people were just born to be followers, unable to comprehend the high stakes of the visionary lifestyle. Sasha looked at him with a gaze that was almost pornographic in its intensity. She was not looking at a business partner, she was looking at her golden ticket. She believed they had pulled it off. The bankers and family friends began to murmur their approval, turning to one another to praise the dynamic couple. They commented on how perfectly Kyle and Sasha complemented each other, completely erasing my existence from the narrative. To them, I was just the help, a background character in the story of Kyle's inevitable success. Kyle rubbed his hands together, his face flushed with the high of his own lies. He announced that he wanted to be completely open with his investors, so he was going to display the digital contract right now on the big screen. He wanted everyone to see the terms of the $50 million deal with their own eyes. He moved to his laptop, preparing to open the PDF that would validate his fantasy. The trap was set, and he was walking into it with a smile on his face. Kyle stood with his back to the massive screen, his hand hovering over the laptop trackpad as he struggled to locate the file for the contract. He was so focused on projecting an image of technological competence that he had committed the cardinal sin of presentation etiquette. He had forgotten to activate the Do Not Disturb mode. Unbeknownst to him, the 85-inch television, currently the brightest light source in the room, was mirroring every pixel of his personal phone's interface for the entire assembly of bankers and family friends to see. As he clicked through his folders, searching for the PDF that would supposedly secure his legacy, the room suddenly filled with the cheerful, chirping sound of an incoming iMessage. It was a sound designed to be friendly, but in that moment, it sounded like the click of a loaded gun. A notification banner dropped down from the top of the screen, overlaying the revenue projections with a sleek gray bubble. The sender was saved in his contacts as Sasha, followed by a hyphen, and then future partner. The irony was thick enough to choke on, but the content of the message was what sucked the oxygen out of the room. The text was crisp and legible, magnified to the size of a billboard. It read, simply and brutally, "Wrap it up fast, baby. I cannot wait to celebrate on top of you tonight." It was followed by a winking face and a water droplet emoji. The silence that descended on the room was instantaneous and absolute. It was as if someone had opened a valve and flooded the living room with liquid nitrogen, freezing everyone in place. The murmurs of admiration died in the throats of the guests. The clinking of silverware stopped. For 3 agonizing seconds, the only movement in the room was the dust motes dancing in the projector light. I looked over at Madeline. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, the one she usually held court in like a queen. Her mouth had fallen open, unhinged by shock. The expensive crystal wine glass in her hand was tilting dangerously to the right, the red liquid creeping toward the rim, threatening to stain the Persian rug she was so proud of. She stared at the screen, her brain unable to process the vulgarity that had just invaded her carefully curated evening. Kyle realized something was wrong only when he saw the horrified expressions of the audience. He spun around to look at the screen, and panic seized him. His face drained of color, leaving him looking pasty and sweaty, in a desperate, clumsy attempt to hide the evidence. He lunged for his phone, which was sitting on the podium. He intended to swipe the notification away or turn off the screen, but his hands were shaking, and his fingers were slippery with nervous sweat. Instead of dismissing the notification, he tapped directly on it. The message expanded. The operating system, obeying his command, opened the full conversation history. And because modern technology is designed to be helpful, it immediately loaded the image attachment that Sasha had sent just seconds after the text. It was a selfie. It was taken in the guest bathroom of this very house, identifiable by the distinctive floral wallpaper in the background. Sasha was posing in the mirror, wearing absolutely nothing, blowing a kiss to the camera. On the 85-inch screen, the image was grotesque in its clarity. Every detail was magnified. The guests were treated to a panoramic view of the woman standing next to Kyle, stripped of her business suit and her dignity. Sasha, who had been standing with her chin held high, froze. The blood left her face so fast she looked like a wax statue. Her industrial strength smile, which she had worn like armor all evening, vanished instantly. She looked at the screen, then at the bankers, then at the floor, realizing there was nowhere to hide. The room remained in a state of paralyzed horror, a vacuum of shock where no one knew where to look or what to say. And then, from the shadows of the corner where I stood with my tray of champagne, a sound broke the silence. It was a laugh, my laugh. It was soft, low, and genuinely amused. The only human sound in a room full of statues. Madeline finally found her voice, and it was a shriek that could shatter glass. She thrust a shaking, manicured finger at the screen, demanding to know what the hell was displayed in front of her guests. The wine glass she had been tilting finally gave way, splashing dark red liquid all over the cream-colored carpet she valued more than her son's integrity. Kyle looked like a trapped animal. He stammered, his hands waving uselessly in the air as he tried to block the view of the screen with his body, which only drew more attention to it. He pleaded with the room, claiming that everyone was misunderstanding the situation. He insisted that it was a spam attack, a malicious hacker targeting high-profile businessmen, and that his account had been compromised by cyber criminals. It was a desperate, pathetic lie, the kind a teenager would tell when caught with cigarettes, not a grown man caught with a mistress. I stepped out from the shadows of the corner, moving to the center of the room with a slow, deliberate gait. My voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that cut through his panic like a scalpel. I asked him calmly which specific hacker would have access to nude photographs of his business partner sent directly from her personal cell phone number. I looked him in the eye and asked if the hackers also staged the photo in our downstairs bathroom. Sasha, realizing her reputation was evaporating by the second, tried to pivot. She smoothed her hair and forced a tight, trembling smile, attempting to regain control of the narrative. She declared that this was clearly a technical glitch or a deep fake, and she urged everyone to remain professional. She looked at the bankers and said that we should focus on the $50 million contract, insisting that private matters should not interfere with such a monumental financial opportunity. She was trying to sell the idea that money washed away all sins. My father-in-law, Richard, jumped on that lifeline immediately. The greed in his eyes was stronger than any sense of morality. He nodded vigorously, wiping sweat from his forehead, and agreed with Sasha. He muttered that men would be men and that personal indiscretions could be discussed later, but the priority had to be securing the signature on the deal. He was willing to sell his son's marriage and his own dignity for a check he desperately needed to pay off his gambling debts. I had heard enough. I walked over to the main coffee table and dropped the heavy silver serving tray. It landed with a loud, violent clang that silenced the room instantly. The crystal glasses rattled, and every pair of eyes shifted to me. I looked at Richard, then at Sasha, and finally at Kyle. I told them clearly that there would be no contract. Kyle snapped. The vein in his neck bulged as he turned his rage toward me. He screamed at me to shut up. He accused me of being a jealous, petty woman who was willing to ruin his big moment because I was insecure. He pointed a trembling finger at the stairs and ordered me to go to my room immediately, treating me like a disobedient child who had spoken out of turn. I did not move. Instead, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my own phone. I told him that I was not ruining his career. I told him that I was the only person in the world who had the right to decide if his career even existed. I tapped my screen once. Since I had already compromised the network to intercept the feed earlier, I easily overrode Kyle's connection. The grotesque image of Sasha vanished from the 85-inch television. In its place, a crisp, professional interface appeared. It was the internal email system of Nexus Capital, marked with the highest security clearance. The room gasped again, but this time it was not out of scandal. It was out of confusion. Displayed on the screen was an email sent 2 minutes ago. The subject line read, Re Prescott Group Investment Proposal. The body of the email was short and brutal. It stated that the board had rejected the proposal due to fraudulent documentation and gross incompetence. But it was the signature block at the bottom that froze the blood in Kyle's veins. It did not say Investment Committee. It read, in bold, authoritative letters, Ilara Vance, founder and chairman of the board, Nexus Capital. The silence in the room shifted from shock to a heavy, suffocating realization. Kyle stood frozen, his eyes glued to the television screen where my name loomed over him in high-definition block letters. He read the words over and over again. Chairman, founder, Ilara Vance. He looked at me, then back at the screen, his eyes bulging as if his brain was violently rejecting the visual input. He looked like a man who had just realized the insect he tried to crush was actually a landmine. Sasha took a stumbling step backward, her high heels catching on the edge of the expensive rug. She shook her head violently, her composure fracturing completely. She whispered that it was impossible. She insisted that I was just a filing clerk, a nobody who organized tax returns for a living and clipped coupons. She tried to force a laugh to dismiss the absurdity of it all, but it came out as a dry, terrified choke. I took a step toward her, and for the first time since she entered my home, she flinched. I looked her up and down with clinical detachment. I told her that I knew exactly who she was. I addressed her as Sasha Miller, a woman who had been fired from 3 separate startup companies in the Bay Area for embezzling petty cash and sleeping with the operations directors to cover her tracks. I told her I knew about the fake references she bought online and the sealed court records regarding her fraud charges. I told her I had run a full background check on her the morning Kyle mentioned her name, and I had been watching her dig her own grave ever since. Madeline gripped the velvet armrest of her chair, her knuckles turning white. She looked at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into her home, not the woman who had lived under her roof for 3 years. She stammered my name. She asked, with genuine, pathetic confusion, how I could possibly be the chairman of Nexus Capital. She asked why I had never told them. I laughed, a short, humorless sound that echoed in the quiet room. I told her the truth. I explained that in 3 years of marriage, not a single one of them had ever asked me about my day, my career, or my thoughts. I told her that to them. I was just the person who brewed the coffee, ironed the shirts, and absorbed their insults about my working-class background. I told her they were so busy playing aristocrats and looking down on me that they never noticed the royalty sitting at their dinner table. I turned my attention back to my husband. He was shaking now, his face pale and sweaty. I reminded him of what he had said to me at dinner just a few nights ago. He had told me to stop overreacting. I nodded slowly. I told him that I agreed with his advice. I told him that I was done overreacting and that I was now going to react exactly as a business partner should. I gestured to the screen where the rejection email still glowed. I informed them that Nexus Capital had not just rejected their proposal. I told them that as of 9 o'clock this morning, my firm had purchased the entirety of the Prescott family debt from their frustrated creditors. I had bought the mortgage on this rented mansion, the predatory loans on Richard's failed ventures, and even the massive credit card debt Madeline used to maintain her wardrobe. I let the words hang in the air, heavy and final. I told them that this meant I was no longer just their daughter-in-law or the ignored wife. I told them slowly and clearly that I was now the sole creditor of this entire family. I owned their debts, which meant, effectively, I owned them. Richard made a strangulated choking sound and collapsed back onto the sofa, his face turning the color of old ash. He looked like he was having a cardiac event, but I knew it was just the crushing weight of poverty hitting him for the first time in his life. The guests, sensing the radioactive toxicity of the situation, began to scramble. The bankers and socialites muttered awkward excuses, grabbing their coats and fleeing the scene as if the house were physically on fire. Within 2 minutes, the room was empty, leaving the Prescotts alone in the wreckage of their pride, staring at the woman they had underestimated for years. Sasha realized the game was completely over before anyone else did. While the Prescotts were still processing the shock of my new title, she was already edging toward the French doors, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat looking for a sewer grate. She tried to slip away quietly, hoping the chaos would cover her exit, but I was not about to let her walk away. I called out her name loud and clear. I told her to stop right there because the Economic Crimes Division was already waiting for her at the main gate. She froze, her hand hovering over the brass handle of the door. I explained with a calm satisfaction that while she was busy in the study pretending to be a mogul and seducing my husband, I had been busy too. I had forwarded the entire dossier of her forged bank statements, the fake wire transfers, and the identity theft records to the federal authorities early that afternoon. I told her I had hit send on that email 4 hours ago. As if on cue, the room was suddenly bathed in flashing red and blue lights from the driveway. The wail of sirens cut through the heavy silence of the mansion, shattering whatever composure Sasha had left. She dissolved instantly. The arrogant, buzzword-spouting businesswoman vanished, replaced by a terrified criminal facing jail time. She burst into tears, a loud, ugly sobbing that echoed off the high ceilings. She spun around and grabbed Kyle's arm, digging her nails into his suit jacket. She begged him to do something, to call his lawyers, to tell them it was a mistake. But Kyle stood there, paralyzed and shaking, unable to look at her, let alone save her. When she realized Kyle was useless, she let go of him. Kyle, seeing his entire world collapsing, dropped to his knees. He crawled across the Persian rug until he was at my feet, ignoring the guests who were still fleeing the scene. He grabbed my hand, tears streaming down his handsome, empty face. He switched tactics immediately, moving from arrogance to pathetic begging. He told me that he was seduced. He claimed she had tricked him, that he was weak, and that he only went along with it because he wanted to secure the money for us. He swore on his life that he was doing it all to build a better future for our marriage. I looked down at him with the same detachment I would feel for a stranger's unruly child. I pulled my hand away from his grasp, wiping it on my skirt as if he were something unclean. I told him that the future of us had ended the exact moment he told me to shut my mouth at the dinner table to protect his mistress. I told him there was no us anymore. There was just me, the creditor, and him, the debtor. Madeline rushed forward then, abandoning all her airs of nobility. She tried to grab my arm, her face twisted in a rictus of panic. She started apologizing profusely, her voice trembling. She called herself foolish and old, claiming she had been blinded by Sasha's lies. She pleaded with me, saying that we were family, that we were people of the same house, and that we could work this out internally. I shook her off with a sharp, violent motion. I told her the brutal truth that had been festering for 3 years. I told her she had never considered me family. To her, I was just the help that she did not have to pay, I was the person she mocked to her friends and the target of her insecurities. I told her she only liked me now because she realized I held the checkbook. I stepped back, putting distance between myself and the three of them. Richard was slumped on the couch, gasping for air. Madeline was weeping. Kyle was broken on the floor. I delivered the final verdict. I informed them that since I held the mortgage and the liens on all their assets, I was exercising my right to foreclose immediately. I gave them exactly 24 hours to vacate the premises. I reached for my left hand and slid the diamond wedding band off my finger. It was a modest ring, one Kyle had bought with money he borrowed from his father years ago. I looked at Sasha's counterfeit orange handbag, which was lying on the floor where Madeline had dropped it in her shock. I tossed the ring. It hit the fake leather bag with a dull thud. I told them that they were a perfect match because they were both cheap imitations of the real thing. The front doors burst open with a crash. Uniformed officers swarmed into the living room. They grabbed Sasha, who began screaming and kicking, dragging her out of the house in handcuffs. The scene was chaotic, loud, and violent, a perfect ending to the facade of the Prescott family. I watched the police haul her away, leaving my husband and his parents alone in the ruins of their life, while I stood untouched in the center of the storm. Kyle stood up and tried to grab my hands again, desperate to salvage the wreck he had made of his life. He started babbling about our history, bringing up our first date at the coffee shop in Seattle and the rainy afternoon we spent watching movies when we first moved in together. He tried to invoke the memory of the woman who used to look at him with adoration, but as I watched him sweat and cry, I felt absolutely nothing but a deep, churning revulsion. It was like watching a stranger beg for change using a script I had heard 1,000 times. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. I pressed it against his chest until he instinctively grabbed it. I told him that inside he would find a divorce decree that was already drafted, signed, and notarized. I reminded him of the infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement, the one he had signed without reading because he was so arrogant he thought he was the prize. I explained that the video footage from tonight and the text messages on the big screen constituted irrefutable proof of adultery. According to the contract, he was leaving this marriage with exactly $0 My father-in-law, Richard, suddenly found a burst of courage. He stood up, his face purple with rage, and threatened to sue me for breach of trust and fraud. He claimed I had manipulated them and that he would drag me through every court in the state. I looked at him and laughed softly. I told him that if he wanted to involve the law, we should start by discussing the tax returns he filed in 2019. I mentioned that during my audit of his debts, I found the offshore accounts he had conveniently forgotten to declare to the Internal Revenue Service. Richard shut his mouth so fast his teeth clicked together. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking gray and old. He looked at me and finally realized the truth. He had spent years thinking I was a harmless goldfish swimming in his bowl, but he was actually trapped in a tank with a shark. He sank back into the sofa, defeated and silent. I turned my back on them and walked up the grand staircase to the master bedroom. I did not need much time. I have always been a minimalist, partially by choice and partially because I never truly felt at home in this museum of pretension. It took me less than 15 minutes to pack my clothes, my laptop, and the few personal items that actually mattered to me into a single suitcase. As I zipped the bag shut, the shouting started downstairs. I could hear Madeline screaming at Kyle. She was not yelling at him because he had cheated on his wife. She was screaming at him because he had been stupid enough to cheat on a gold mine. She called him an idiot and a failure, asking how he could destroy their only chance at financial salvation for a fling with a fraudster. The family was tearing itself apart, turning on each other the moment the money dried up. It was exactly the cannibalistic nature I had predicted. I pulled out my phone and dialed my executive assistant. I gave the order to freeze all the auxiliary accounts I had set up for Kyle. I told my assistant to cut off the credit cards for his gas, his gym membership, and his wine club effective immediately. I wanted him to feel the cold reality of an empty wallet before the sun came up. I walked down the stairs for the final time, the wheels of my suitcase clicking rhythmically against the marble steps. I looked around the foyer. The chandelier was sparkling, and the architecture was grand, but the house felt rotten to the core. I saw the cracks in the plaster and the stains on the rugs that they tried so hard to hide. Kyle was standing by the front door. He looked small and pathetic, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with his own tears. He looked at me with the eyes of a dog that had been kicked, waiting for me to show a mercy that simply did not exist. I walked past him, the clicking of my heels on the marble echoing his defeat. I reached the heavy brass doorknob and finally paused, taking one last look at the wreckage I was leaving behind. The living room, once their stage for looking down on me, was now a scene of absolute misery. Richard was slumped on the sofa like a deflated balloon, staring blankly at the wall. Madeline was weeping into her hands, her mascara running down her face in black streaks. And Kyle stood in the middle of the room, a man stripped of his arrogance, looking utterly lost. He looked up at me, his eyes red and raw. He asked me in a voice that was barely a whisper how long I had been planning this. He wanted to know when I stopped being his wife and started being his executioner. I adjusted the lapel of my blazer, smoothing out a non-existent wrinkle. I looked him dead in the eye and gave him the unvarnished truth. I told him it started the day I overheard him tell his parents that I was just a temporary investment, a safe bet until something better came along. I told him that in business, you do not hold on to a failing asset. You wait for the market to peak, and then you liquidate. I told him that tonight was simply my liquidation event. Madeline lifted her head, her face twisted with spite. She screamed that I would regret this. She shrieked that I was heartless and that I would end up all alone in my cold, empty tower. She tried to curse me with solitude, thinking it was the worst fate imaginable. I smiled, and for the first time in years, it was a genuine, radiant smile that reached my eyes. I told her that she was missing the point. I told her that I would rather be alone at the summit of a mountain than crowded together in the mud with people like them. I told her that solitude was a luxury she could no longer afford. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The wind felt like freedom. At the bottom of the steps, a sleek, black sedan was waiting. My personal driver, who had been on standby for 3 hours, stepped out and opened the rear door. I slid onto the leather seat, the scent of expensive conditioning filling my lungs. I did not look back when the heavy front door of the mansion slammed shut, sealing the tomb of the Prescott family legacy. As the car pulled away, my phone chimed with a soft, pleasant notification. It was not a spam text or a desperate plea from an ex-husband. It was an alert from my private banking app. The first tranche of funds from the foreclosure and the liquidation of the Prescott debts had just hit my account. It was a profit of over $3 million in a single night. I looked down at my phone and realized the casting icon was still active. The 85-inch television in the living room was still mirroring my device. I decided to leave them one final parting gift. I typed out a quick message. Postscript. You forgot to log out. Good luck with life without a filter. I hit send. I imagined the words popping up on the giant screen, looming over them in the dark living room. I told the driver to take me to the penthouse. As the car accelerated onto the highway, merging into the stream of lights heading toward the city, I closed my eyes and breathed in the silence. Behind me, I left a shattered family and a man screaming into the void, but ahead of me, the city was shining like a diamond, and I owned every piece of it. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from so we can share our thoughts together. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lily Revenge Stories, like this video, and smash that hype button so this story can reach even more people.